Hey everybody, welcome back. This is a video for Economics of Education, looking at Chapter 8 where we talk about, of the Levenheim textbook, Economics of Education, and we're talking about local funding of schools. And this is cool, it's using kind of the same stuff we used before with production possibilities, frontiers, and budget constraints, but now we're looking at the problem of local revenue being used to fund schools and solutions to it. And so this problem is from the textbook. It's problem 9 from chapter 8, and it's pretty simple and straightforward, so it's just a little participation activity that I want us to do together. But it looks at the different levels of revenue that school districts can expect based on the value of homes in that neighborhood. And then we'll talk a little bit about what we haven't gotten to yet in class, but is in the textbook and is part of this chapter we were covering, which is grants. Ways that higher levels of government can help subsidize those school districts. And so remember, we're thinking about local government being the school district, and then state government above that, and then federal government above that. And federal and state governments can subsidize local school district budgets to try and help them equalize per pupil spending and solve the problem of differences in home values and property tax revenues neighborhood to neighborhood. And so this problem is on Canvas, and it is in the Levenheim textbook, but I'll go over it with y'all right now. So the problem says both Springfield Public Schools and Shelbyville Public Schools are fully financed by local taxes. Local taxes are 1% on all property. In Shelbyville, the average house is worth $150,000, and in Springfield, the average house is worth $100,000. So that's where the difference is going to be. They have the same tax rate of 1%, but Shelbyville homes are worth $50,000 more on average. And that's what we're just going to look at. We're just going to look at those averages. So Shelbyville is worth $150,000, Springfield $100,000. Each town has 10,000 houses and can spend its revenue on either schooling or community goods. And we talked about this in class, and this gets back to that PPF model where we have one input, in this case, tax revenue, and then the local government can choose to spend that local property tax revenue on either education or everything else. And so the two problems we want to answer are we want to calculate the total amount of tax revenue for each town and draw the budget constraint for those two school districts. And then the next thing we'll talk about is what would happen if the state government wanted to equalize school spending. So what we want to start with first is the math problem in this. And the math problem is to say that we have two school districts. We have Springfield, and I'm going to write this on paper because I don't have my dry erase board, and we have Shelbyville. And they both face a tax rate of 1% or 0.01. They both have 10,000 homes. The big difference is the value of the homes. Springfield homes are worth $100,000. And Shelbyville homes are worth $150,000. So I've got that set up like this on my paper, right? So far, so good. And what I want to calculate is the tax revenue for each community. And so I'm going to take the tax rate times the home value and then multiply it by 10,000 homes. So if a home is worth $100,000, tax on that is going to be 1% of $100,000. There are 10,000 homes, so I want to multiply that by 10,000. Pretty straightforward math, right? So for Springfield, it's going to be $100,000 times 0.01, and then multiply all of that by 10,000 homes. And that's going to give me my total tax revenue for the city of Springfield, which is going to be $10 million, right? See? Makes sense? So far, so good? Cool. The next thing I'm going to do is the same thing for Shelbyville. Shelbyville has homes that are an average of $150,000. times the tax rate of 0.01 times 10,000 homes equals $15 million. In tax revenue. So now I have the total tax revenue, for both Shelbyville and for Springfield, right? And the difference is based on the different home values, right? Shelbyville has more expensive homes than Springfield, so Shelbyville is going to have higher tax revenue. So far, so good? Let's do it this way. There we go. All right. So the next part of this problem is to graph this. And what we want to do is graph this as a production possibilities frontier. Remember, a PPF shows all the possible combinations of production given a single input and two outputs. In this case, our two outputs, or our two expenditures, are education and everything else. And that's one of the common ways we can use a PPF or a budget constraint to model something, is by picking something we're interested in this case, education, and then lumping everything together into one aggregated group. So I'm going to go ahead and put schooling, which is R, on the x-axis, and everything else, which is X, on the y-axis. Oops, I spelled that wrong. Well, that's going to be messy. I wrote every else instead of everything else. You can see it right there. And we don't know how much schooling and everything else cost, but that's okay. Because what we're talking about here is not about buying a level of schooling. We're talking about how to allocate a budget. And so Springfield has $10 million. Of that, each dollar could be spent on either education, schooling, that are, or everything else. And that's the way you want to think of it. How do we want to allocate this budget? Do we want to spend it on schooling or everything else? So our options are to spend 10 million on schooling, or 900 or 99, what is it? It'd be 99,900,000, whatever. We could spend $1 on everything else, or $2, or whatever we want. And so those are our options. And so I'm going to go ahead and draw the production possibilities frontier for Springfield. I'm going to make it green because I made Springfield green. And they can either spend their total revenue on education or on everything else. Oops. There we go. Not my best work, but that's okay. Cool. Where is Shelbyville's production possibilities frontier going to be? It's going to be beyond it because they have more revenue. They have $5 million more than Springfield does. So they're going to have a PPF that's further out. And I'll label these for myself. This one, I think, has one of the easier graphing problems we've done so far, right? Because really, you're just drawing two PPFs, which is just two straight lines. And Shelbyville can either spend their $15 million on schooling or everything else, or any combination in between the two. Make sense? So far, so good? That's part A. That's basically half of the assignment. The second part, part B, says, hey, what if the government wants to equalize spending between the two cities, the two local governments? And that's what this second part of this chapter says, is that, okay, we've established that we want to equalize spending between school districts. We want to try and make things fairer. One of the ways we can do that is with a grant from the federal or the state government. The problem is there's going to be some unintended consequences, right? With economics, nothing is simple, nothing is straightforward, everything is a little bit complicated. And so what we're going to see is with this grant, we can give the government that money, but it's kind of like when you give the government money, it's like giving people money. They're going to have different goals than what our policy intentions might be. So think about one of the things that's contemporary right now is gas prices being very high, and talk about a gas relief payment, basically giving residents some money to compensate them for the additional costs that the additional pressure gas is putting on their budgets. If you get, say, a $400 check from the government to help compensate you for that additional gasoline expense, are you going to spend all of it on gas, or are you going to spend some of it on everything else? Probably some of the money gets spent on cheeseburgers, or maybe some of it goes towards your rent, or you end up spending it on movie tickets or something. The problem with subsidizing any entity, a person, a firm, a government, is that if the goods they consume are normal goods, meaning they have a positive price or income, a positive income elasticity of demand, that means that when you get more money, you buy more of everything. And so the government can issue a grant to the government of Springfield, give Springfield $5 million to equalize educational spending. But Springfield will probably spend some of that money on everything else. And that's what the second part of that chapter, this chapter on local funding, is going to talk about. The unintended consequences of subsidizing education, the fact that money doesn't always go where we want it to when we do issue a federal grant or a state grant. And so that's what Part B is all about. Part B says the state government wants to equalize spending in the two districts. To do this, it provides a block grant to Springfield for the difference in tax revenues. What's the difference in tax revenues? It's that $5 million. So it's going to be a $5 million grant. And a block grant is just another way of saying just a set amount of money, right? And that's going to go to Springfield to help get their spending up to the level of Shelbyville. The question asks, assuming there is no effect on property values, so nothing else changes, ceteris paribus, right? Will this necessarily lead to the same amount of spending across districts? And that's what I want to get at, right? So if we look at so this is what I'm just saying here, right? We'd add a $5 million grant for Springfield. That's going to shift their PPF out to the same level as Shelbyville's, but that doesn't mean that all of the additional $5 million is going to go towards education. If everything else the government spends money on is also considered a normal good or something that is positively related to income in terms of elasticity, if it's anything that's a positive good, then we're going to see some of that grant money or some of that budget constraint allocated towards everything else. So even though we match Springfield's revenue with Shelbyville's revenue with that block grant, there is no guarantee that all of the grant money gets spent on education. So we won't necessarily see the same amount of spending in both districts. And that's a big takeaway. Does that kind of make sense? Hopefully. If not, we're going to talk about it together in class next time. But now you've got a sense of one of the unintended consequences of subsidizing education. So the answer to Part B is that, yeah, that $5 million will increase Springfield's revenue overall, and it will increase education spending, but it'll also increase spending on everything else. And so it might not end up equalizing spending across districts. It depends. It's complicated. And that's what we're going to get into. All right. Hopefully that helps you solve the participation activity for this week and gets you set up to talk more about local funding and other issues in education when we come back on Tuesday. Let me know what questions you have. Hit up the Canvas discussion thread, send me an email, or hit up the comments here, and I'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.